Hi. Yesterday, hopefully you listened to the class session on the first page. So we already discussed how slavery looked like it was not going to make it in the late 1700s, but when Eli Whitney went through a series of disasters, he ended up in the South and invented the cotton gin, which actually um, made slavery more profitable, unfortunately. So big deal here is an invention, and a one person can make a huge difference. They can have a negative impact, and they can have a positive impact. So that's what the first page was about. But today, what we did in class was something a little different, where each there were two people who had a paragraph to become an expert on, and so they actually we sat in a circle and rotated through our partners, and they taught each other what their paragraphs were about. So what I'm going to do is read and then kind of sum up what um, these paragraphs are all about. So you'll have a good idea of how slavery had an impact on the South, and it wasn't good. All right. So it says, although slavery was highly profitable, it had a negative impact on the Southern economy. And I underlined that. That's the main idea of this reading. And it impeded the development of industry and cities, and it contributed to high debt, soil exhaustion, and a lack of technological innovation. So impede means like slow down or was an obstacle to industry and cities. So the rest of the reading is about this lack of development and why the South didn't have very many large cities, how it contributed to high debt, how it contributed to soil exhaustion, and so forth. Okay. So the second paragraph reads, the philosopher and poet Ralph Waldo Emerson said that quote, slavery is no scholar, no improver. It does not love the whistle of the railroad. It does not love the newspaper, the mailbag, a college, a book, or a preacher who has the absurd whim of saying what he thinks. It does not increase the white population. It does not improve the soil. Everything goes to decay. There appears to be a large element of truth in Emerson's observation. So basically, to sum up, he's saying slavery is pointless, to borrow from another student. He said it does not do anything positive for the whole entire society. It does not educate. It does not improve the soil, and that refers to soil exhaustion. It does not increase the white population. So Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a philosopher of the Transcendentalism era, which we talked about, observed, I think, very accurately what slavery actually did. So it says the South, like other slave societies, did not develop urban centers, meaning cities, for commerce, which means trade, finance, and industry on a scale equal to those found in the North. Virginia's largest city, Richmond, had a population of just 15,274 in 1850. That same year, Wilmington, North Carolina's largest city, had only 7,264 inhabitants, while Natchez and Vicksburg, the two largest cities in Mississippi, had fewer than 3,000 white inhabitants. So it's talking about these are large cities in the South, but compared to the North, these were tiny. Okay. And they didn't do any trade or financial business other than selling their crops. Okay. And not much industry unless it had to do with their crops. Okay. Those southern cities were small because they failed to develop diversified economies. Diversified, like the root word is diverse, which means different. So they failed to develop diversified economies, meaning they only focused on agriculture or farming. Okay, so if something happens to your crops, like let's say a flood or a drought, you're toast. You're not going to be making any money. You might go into debt. You might have to go to a bank in the north and ask for a loan. because you made no money to support your family or your plantation. So unlike the cities of the North, southern cities rarely became processing or finishing centers, and southern ports rarely engaged in international trade. Their primary functions were to market and transport cotton or other agricultural crops, supply local planters and farmers with such necessities as agricultural implements or tools, and produce the small number of manufactured goods, such as cotton gins needed by farmers. So they're only focusing on improving something if it's for farming. All right. So they didn't even have like textile mills to take the cotton to make it into cloth. They had to ship it to the north. And that's why southern cities were so small, because they needed land for farming, not to make cities. So there was no need for large cities. An overemphasis on slave-based agriculture led Southerners to neglect industry and transportation improvements. So they did have a little bit of industry, again, only for farming. And the transportation, they had railroads, but they didn't use them for transporting people. It was only transporting crops, so it wasn't very good. As a result, manufacturing and transportation lagged far behind in comparison to the North. In 1860, the North had approximately 1.3 million industrial workers, whereas the South had 110,000. And Northern factories manufactured 9/10 or 90% of the industrial goods produced in the United States. So only 10% of any manufactured items was coming from the South, because they were only really focused on farming. The South's transportation network was primitive, meaning really old school, by Northern standards. So traveling the 1,460 overland miles from Baltimore down to New Orleans in 1850 meant that you had to ride 5 different railroads, 2 stagecoaches, and 2 steamboats. That is a lot of traveling back then, even today. Most southern railroads served primarily to transport cotton to southern ports, where the crop could be shipped on northern vessels to northern or British factories for processing. So transportation, again, wasn't for people, it was for crops. So there really wasn't a need to improve the transportation efficiency. Because of high rates of personal debt, Southern states kept taxation and government spending at much lower levels than did the states in the North, though taxes helped fund public education, and it still does. Okay, so as a result, Southerners lagged far behind Northerners in their support for public education. And as a result of that, illiteracy was widespread. Now, if you are illiterate, that means you cannot read or write. So what they're saying is, because they didn't support public education, because they didn't have the money for it, many people were uneducated. White people, let alone slaves, of course, but even white people were not very well educated. It says in 1850, 20% of all Southern white adults could not read or write. That's 2 in 10 people. And compared to today's standards, that's a huge, okay? Even compared to back then, it says while the illiteracy rate in New England, like in New York and New Jersey and Massachusetts, was less than half of 1%. It means obviously almost over 99% of the people, the adults in northern part of the United States could read or write. It's not good. Because large slaveholders owned most of the region's slaves, wealth was more stratified than in the North, meaning at different levels. In the Deep South, the middle class held a relatively small portion of the region's property, while wealthy planters owned a very significant portion of the productive lands and slave labor. So what they're saying is there were very few rich people, and they owned the most land. For example, it says in 1850, 17% of the farming population held 2/3 of all acres in the rich cotton growing regions of the South. That's a small percentage that owned the majority of the land. Okay. Okay, last little bit. There are indications that during the last decade before the Civil War, slave ownership became increasingly concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. Soil erosion and exhaustion diminished the availability of cotton land. Scarcity and heavy demand forced the price of land and slaves to rise beyond the reach of most. So what it's saying is only the rich could afford new land. And they had to purchase new land because soil erosion, meaning taking the soil from one place to the other, usually through water, and exhaustion, meaning the soil didn't have the minerals or the nutrients to grow the cotton or whatever crop they're growing. So if the land isn't productive, then you're going to have to get more land. So that drove the price of the land up because it was becoming more and more rare to find good land. And only the uber wealthy could afford it. Okay. So it says in newer cotton growing regions, yeoman farmers, that's small town farmers, were pushed off the land as planters expanded their holdings. In Louisiana, for example, nearly half of all rural white families owned no land. So that means they're working for someone else. Okay. Though during the 1850s, the percentage of the total white population owning slaves declined significantly. Though by 1860, the proportion of whites holding slaves had fallen from about 1/3 to 1/4. As slave and land ownership grew more concentrated, a growing number of whites were forced by economic pressure to leave the land and move to urban centers. So because they couldn't farm, because they couldn't own the land, they either stopped farming and moved to cities, or they even picked up and moved north. All right, so this portion of the reading was all about how slavery had a negative impact on the Southern economy. Hint, hint, that might be one of your test questions, like short answer test questions that you will have at the end of this unit. Okay. So how did slavery have a negative impact on the Southern economy? All right. So that is it, and I will see you later. Maybe.